She lowered her eyes and whispered, "I can't have children." But the cowboy standing across from her didn't walk away. Rain hammered the cabin roof while Rosalie gripped the edge of the table hard enough to whiten her knuckles. The fire behind Cole snapped low and uneven. For a long moment, he said nothing at all. Then his boots creaked once across the floorboards, and tears filled her eyes before he even touched her hand. What did that cowboy say that night? Tell me where you're watching from before we begin. The first snow came early that year. By the last week of November, the hills outside Cedar Ridge had turned pale beneath a thin layer of ice, and the dirt road leading to Rosalie Bennett's cabin cracked hard beneath wagon wheels before sunrise. Smoke rose slowly from the chimney above her roof, thin and gray against the morning sky. Rosalie stood beside the well with both hands wrapped around the rope. The bucket scraped against old wood as she pulled it upward inch by inch. Cold water splashed across her fingers. She ignored it. The cabin sat nearly a mile outside town, tucked beside a line of pine trees where the wind hit hardest in winter. Most people preferred it that way. It kept her far enough from Cedar Ridge that they only had to think about her when their shirts needed mending or a child came down with fever. She carried the bucket inside and poured water into a dented kettle, blackened from years above the stove. The room smelled faintly of coffee grounds, soap, and cedar smoke. Her sewing basket rested beside the window, with 2 unfinished coats folded neatly beside it. Outside, chickens scratched beneath the frost. Inside, the clock on the wall ticked softly. Rosalie tied her dark hair back with a faded ribbon and sat by the window to work. Her needle moved steadily through thick denim while the morning light spread across the wooden floorboards. Around noon, she wrapped a wool coat around her shoulders and headed toward town with the finished clothes folded carefully inside a sack. Cedar Ridge looked half asleep beneath the cold. Men stood outside the saloon drinking coffee from tin cups. Horses snorted clouds into the air beside the hitching posts. Somewhere farther down the street, a hammer struck metal in steady rhythm from the blacksmith shop. Rosalie kept her eyes forward. At the general store, Mrs. Holloway accepted the repaired coats without meeting her gaze for long. "Thank you," the woman said quietly. Rosalie nodded once. A little boy near the candy barrel stared at her with open curiosity until his mother gently pulled him closer to her side. Not cruel, just careful. That was usually worse. By late afternoon, the wind shifted sharply from the north. Snow clouds rolled low across the mountains beyond Wind River. People began leaving town earlier than usual, gathering supplies before the storm hit. Rosalie started home with flour, lamp oil, and coffee packed tightly in the back of her wagon. The first heavy snowflakes fell before she reached the cabin. By nightfall, the storm arrived hard. Wind slammed against the walls, while snow buried the fence posts outside one by one. Rosalie fed more wood into the stove and checked the latch on the front door twice before settling into her chair with a book she never really read. Then came the sound, hoofbeats, slow, uneven. Her body stiffened immediately. Nobody came this far out in weather like this unless something had gone wrong. Rosalie stood and reached for the lantern hanging beside the door. The light shook faintly across the walls as she opened it against the wind. A horse stood near the gate, breathing hard through the snow. The rider sat tall in the saddle despite the storm, broad shoulders out covered in white frost. One gloved hand held the reins, while the other steadied the animal carefully. "My horse threw a shoe crossing the ridge," the man said. His voice was rough from cold. "I saw your light." Rosalie lifted the lantern higher. Cole Mercer. Even alone on horseback in the middle of a storm, he looked exactly like the stories people told about him. Quiet, hard to read. The kind of man folks stepped aside for without realizing they'd done it. The horse shifted painfully. Rosalie noticed blood near its lower leg. "You can use the back stable," she said after a moment. "Storm's too deep to keep riding tonight." Cole nodded once. "Appreciate it, that was all. No charm, no unnecessary talk." He led the horse through the snow while Rosalie walked ahead with the lantern. Inside the small stable behind the cabin, Cole crouched immediately beside the injured leg. His movements stayed calm and practiced, while Rosalie handed him clean cloth strips from an old supply box. "You were a medic once?" he asked quietly. "Nurse." He glanced at her, briefly, then back to the horse. The wind screamed outside the stable walls. Rosalie watched him tighten the bandage carefully beneath the lantern light. Snow melted slowly from the brim of his hat onto his coat collar. Most men in Cedar Ridge talked too much when they were nervous. Cole Mercer barely spoke at all. "You should come inside before the temperature drops further," she said finally. "There's coffee." He hesitated like he almost refused out of habit. Then he nodded. Inside the cabin, the fire warmed the room enough to fog the windows. Rosalie poured coffee into 2 mismatched cups, while Cole stood near the door. Careful not to track too much snow across the floorboards, he removed his gloves slowly. His hands were rough, scarred across the knuckles. "Horse'll make it," Rosalie said. Cole looked toward the fire. "Good." Silence settled between them, but it didn't feel sharp, just unfamiliar. Later that night, after Cole stretched out on a blanket near the stove and the lamps were lowered low, Rosalie lay awake in the next room, listening to small sounds she hadn't heard in years. Footsteps, a chair shifting slightly, another breath inside the house. Strange how quickly a quiet place noticed another person. Morning arrived gray and still. The storm had passed some time before dawn, leaving the world buried under clean white snow. Rosalie stepped onto the porch, wrapped in her coat, and stopped. Cole stood near the front gate with a hammer in one hand. The broken hinge she had ignored for weeks hung repaired beneath fresh nails. "You didn't have to do that," she said. Cole shrugged lightly. Gatewood snapped clean off by next storm. His horse stood saddled nearby, leg wrapped neatly. Rosalie watched him secure the final nail before slipping the hammer back into his saddlebag. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then Cole looked down the long, empty road disappearing toward town. "This road isn't safe for someone living alone," he said. "Not judgment, not pity, just fact." Rosalie crossed her arms against the cold. "Been managing fine. I can see that." Something about the way he said it made her look away first. Cole tipped his hat once before climbing into the saddle. Then he rode off through the snow without another word. Rosalie stood on the porch. Long after the sound of hoofbeats disappeared, the cabin felt strangely still again. That evening, darkness came early. Rosalie had just finished lighting the oil lamp when another knock sounded against the door. She frowned immediately. No one visited twice in one day. When she opened the door, Cole Mercer stood there again, beneath the porch light, snow dusting his shoulders. In one hand, he held a folded gray handkerchief stitched carefully along the edges with fading blue thread. "My mother made this," he said quietly. "Left it here last night." Rosalie looked at the cloth in his hand, then at him, and for reasons she could not yet explain, her heart moved once against her ribs harder than it had the night before. Snow slipped quietly from the porch roof between them. Cole held the handkerchief carefully, almost awkwardly, as though it belonged to another life he rarely touched anymore. The blue stitching along the corners had faded from years in a coat pocket. Rosalie stepped aside without meaning to. "You might as well come in," she said. Cole hesitated only a second before ducking through the doorway. Cold air followed him into the cabin. He removed his hat and stood near the stove while Rosalie poured the last of the coffee into a cup that didn't match the others. "My mother hated wasting anything," he said after a while, glancing at the cloth in his hand. "Used to sew initials into everything I owned so I wouldn't lose it." Rosalie looked down at the neat stitching. "M.M. Mercer Mercer," he said quietly. "She married my father and kept her own name anyway." Something about that made Rosalie almost smile. Outside, the wind eased at last. The storm had broken clean across the valley, leaving Cedar Ridge buried deep enough that most roads would stay closed for 2 days. Cole finished the coffee slowly. Before leaving, he noticed the stack of split wood beside the door had nearly run out. He said nothing about it, just nodded once and disappeared into the snow. An hour later, Rosalie heard the sound of an axe. She stepped onto the porch, wrapped in her coat, and found Cole near the woodpile. Sleeves rolled above his wrists despite the cold. Snow dusted his dark hair, while the axe rose and fell in steady rhythm against the frozen logs. "You don't have to do that," she called. Cole drove the blade through another piece of pine. "I know." That answer unsettled her more than if he had argued. By sunset, the pile beside her porch had doubled in size. He left before dark without asking for supper. Over the next 2 weeks, Cedar Ridge settled into winter fully. Wagon wheels cut deep tracks through packed snow along Main Street. Frost gathered thick along the windows of the saloon every morning. Men warmed their hands around coffee cups at Dawson's Diner before heading toward the cattle yards. Rosalie kept mostly to herself. But now and then, Cole Mercer appeared. Sometimes he stopped by for water while riding north toward the mining trails. Sometimes he asked if the creek road had frozen solid yet. Once he carried a 50-pound sack of flour from town and left it beside her kitchen table, without mentioning how he knew she'd been struggling to lift one at the general store. And always, he left before staying long enough to crowd the room. That was what Rosalie noticed most. The absence of pressure. He never asked why she lived alone, never asked why nobody visited, never asked why she stood at the back of church gatherings without ever stepping inside. Most people poked at loneliness the second they sensed it. Cole treated it like a closed gate he had no intention of forcing open. One Saturday afternoon, Rosalie rode into town for the winter rodeo held behind the livestock pens. Cedar Ridge gathered there every year, no matter the weather. Children chased each other between wagons, while cowboys shouted over snorting horses and clouds of dust. Rosalie only came because Edith Turner insisted. "You can't spend every winter staring at those 4 walls," the older woman had said while wrapping fabric at her store. "Go look at people for once." Now Rosalie stood near the fence in a dark wool coat while the rodeo crowd swayed around her. Somewhere nearby, someone sold roasted peanuts from a cart beside the saloon porch. She saw Cole before he saw her. He leaned against the fence near the arena, hat low over his eyes, speaking quietly with Eli Turner. The younger cowboy laughed at something Cole muttered under his breath. Then a horse bucked hard near the south gate. A scream cut through the noise. Everything happened quickly after that. One of the younger riders lost control during a turn. The horse reared sideways, throwing a small boy standing too close beneath the rail fence. People rushed forward all at once. The child cried out. Rosalie moved before thinking. By the time the crowd reached them, she was already kneeling in the dirt beside the boy, pressing folded cloth against the bleeding cut near his temple. "Don't move him," she snapped sharply when someone reached for the child's arm. The old training came back easily. Steady hands, clear voice, pressure first, check breathing second. The crowd pressed tighter around them until another figure stepped directly beside Rosalie. Cole. He planted himself between her and the staring faces without a word. One hand rested against the fence rail while he looked down at the crowd hard enough that several men stepped back automatically. "Give her room," he said. Not loud, just certain. Rosalie worked quietly while snow drifted lightly across the arena dirt. The boy's crying slowed beneath her touch. Finally, she leaned back slightly. "He'll need stitches. Someone get Doc Harris." The child's mother knelt beside them, trembling. "Thank you," she whispered. Rosalie only nodded and stood. As she wiped blood from her hands with a cloth, she caught fragments of whispers nearby. "That's the woman outside town. Cole Mercer's been spending time there." Vivian Caldwell stood near the fabric booth beneath a fur-lined coat, watching Rosalie with cool eyes. "Well," she said softly enough for others to hear, "I suppose lonely people eventually find each other." The words landed harder than shouting would have. Rosalie lowered her gaze immediately, but before she could step away, Cole moved beside her again. "Ride home with me," he said. It wasn't a request exactly. The mountains disappeared into fog by the time they left Cedar Ridge. Rosalie sat behind him on horseback, while cold wind swept through the pine trees along the ridge trail. Neither spoke much, The horse moved carefully across icy ground, while dusk settled blue over the valley below. At one narrow turn, the animal stumbled lightly. Rosalie instinctively caught hold of Coat to steady herself. His hand covered hers briefly where it rested against him, warm even through the gloves. When they reached her cabin, snow had started falling again in thin silver lines. Cole dismounted first and turned toward her. For a moment, neither moved. Then, slowly, carefully, he lifted one hand toward her face. Rosalie stepped back before he touched her. The movement was small. Still, Cole noticed. A shadow crossed his expression before disappearing just as quickly. "You don't know what people in town are saying," Rosalie said quietly. Cole looked at her for a long moment, while snow settled across the shoulders of his coat. Then he answered in the same calm voice he always used. "I don't live my life inside other people's heads." Rosalie felt the words settle somewhere deep before she could stop them. Cole tipped his hat once and climbed back into the saddle. She stood on the porch, watching him disappear into the fog-covered road until even the sound of hoofbeats was gone. Winter settled harder after that. Snow packed thick against the fence posts outside Rosalie's cabin, and ice formed along the corners of the windows each morning before sunrise. Most days, she woke before dawn, lit the stove, and stood quietly waiting for the kettle to boil while the cabin creaked against the cold. But now there were traces of someone else everywhere. A stack of fresh-cut wood appeared beside the porch every few days without explanation. One afternoon she found the loose hinge on her chicken coop, repaired with clean new screws. Another evening, after coughing through half the night, she opened the front door to discover canned peaches, coffee, and medicine wrapped inside brown paper sitting beside the steps. No note, no knock. Just Cole Mercer's quiet way of staying near without stepping too close. Rosalie hated how much she noticed it. She noticed the sound of his horse before she saw him now. Not because he rode loudly. The opposite. Cole moved through the world with the same steady restraint he used in conversation. Even his silence seemed deliberate. One Sunday morning she passed the church while heading toward Edith Turner's store. Snowmelt dripped from the edge of the roof in slow, steady drops. Inside, voices carried faintly through the open doorway while Reverend Pike spoke to the congregation. "A man needs family," the preacher said. A name carried forward. A home full of children to inherit what he built. Rosalie slowed without meaning to. People inside nodded quietly. Somewhere near the front pew, a woman laughed softly. Rosalie kept walking, but the words followed her all the way down Main Street. At Edith's store, bolts of fabric lined the walls from floor to ceiling. The old woman stood behind the counter, measuring wool beneath the yellow glow of an oil lamp. "You look pale," Edith said without looking up. "I'm fine." That usually means the opposite. Rosalie managed half a smile. Edith folded the fabric carefully. "Cole Mercer was here yesterday." Rosalie's hands stilled against the counter. "He bought thread," Edith continued casually. "Didn't know the first thing about sewing. Nearly argued with me over needle sizes." Rosalie looked down before Edith could catch the warmth rising into her face. Outside the shop window, snow drifted softly across the road. "You should be careful," Edith said, more quietly this time. Rosalie nodded once. "I know." But that wasn't the truth. The truth was she no longer knew anything clearly when it came to Cole Mercer. That night the rain came instead of snow. Cold rain, heavy, enough to shake the roof. Rosalie woke sometime after midnight, coughing hard against the damp air. Her head burned while the rest of her body shivered beneath the blankets. She stumbled from the bed to add wood to the stove, but nearly lost her balance crossing the room. A knock sounded suddenly against the door. 3 short knocks, then silence. Rosalie froze. Only one person knocked like that. She opened the door carefully. Cole stood there, soaked through from the storm, hat dripping rainwater onto the porch boards. "Edith said you looked sick," he said. Rosalie tried to answer, but another cough cut through her chest sharply. Cole's expression changed immediately. Not panic. Focus. He stepped inside, shut the door against the wind, and crossed straight toward the stove. Within minutes he had more wood burning and fresh water heating in the kettle, while Rosalie sat wrapped in blankets near the fire, trying to steady her breathing. "You shouldn't have come out in this weather," she whispered. Cole shrugged out of his wet coat. Road wasn't that bad. Lightning flashed faintly beyond the windows. For a long while neither spoke. Rain hammered against the roof, while steam rose slowly from the coffee cups between them. The cabin glowed gold beneath the lantern light, small and warm against the storm outside. Rosalie stared into the fire. "I was engaged once," she said suddenly. The words surprised even her. Cole didn't move, didn't interrupt. He worked the silver mines outside Laramie. Her voice stayed low. "We were supposed to marry in spring." The fire cracked softly. Rosalie folded her hands tighter around the cup. "Then I got sick." She swallowed once. "The fever nearly killed me," Dr. Harris said afterward. Her voice faltered for the first time. "He said I couldn't have children." Rain rolled heavily down the roof. Rosalie stared at the flames because she could not bear to watch Cole's face while saying the rest. "My fiancé left 3 weeks later." The silence afterward felt endless. Rosalie pressed her lips together hard enough to stop them shaking. "I can't give you the kind of life men stay for," she whispered. Cole said nothing, not immediately, and somehow that hurt worse. Rosalie listened for movement behind her, for boots crossing the floor, for the sound of the door opening into the rain. Instead, she heard only the fire burning low. When she finally looked up, Cole was still sitting there. His elbows rested loosely against his knees while rainwater from his coat darkened the floorboards beneath the chair. He looked tired suddenly, not uncomfortable, not trapped, just honest. "I came here for you," he said quietly. "Not for a child who doesn't even exist yet." Rosalie stared at him. Cole held her gaze steadily. "You think too much about what you can't give people," he continued. "Maybe because too many folks only ever saw you for what they wanted." Something inside her gave way then, not loudly, not dramatically. Her eyes filled before she could stop them. Rosalie turned her face toward the fire, embarrassed by the tears, but Cole didn't pretend not to notice. He only reached over slowly and set his coffee cup closer to her side of the stove where the heat stayed warmer, a small thing. Still, it nearly broke her heart. The storm passed sometime near dawn. Cole stayed the entire night in the chair beside the fire while Rosalie drifted in and out of sleep beneath the blankets. Once half awake, she heard him feeding more wood into the stove. Another time, she felt his hand briefly against her forehead, checking the fever. By morning, the rain had frozen solid across Cedar Ridge. Rosalie woke to pale gray light spilling through the windows. The chair beside the fire sat empty. For one awful second, her chest tightened. Then she saw Cole outside through the frost-covered glass, saddling his horse near the porch. Relief moved through her so quickly it frightened her. She wrapped a blanket around her shoulders and stepped outside. Cole looked up immediately. "You're still sick," he said. "I'm alive." "That's close enough for today." The corner of Rosalie's mouth almost lifted. Cole adjusted the saddle strap quietly. His horse stamped against the frozen ground, breath rising white into the cold morning air. Then Rosalie noticed movement farther down the road, 2 wagons rolling slowly toward town. Men inside them looking directly toward her cabin, toward Cole's horse tied outside, toward the smoke rising from her chimney. One of the drivers tipped his hat slightly with the kind of look that traveled faster than gossip itself. Rosalie felt the blood drain from her face. By noon, all of Cedar Ridge would know Cole Mercer had spent the night at her cabin. And Cedar Ridge never let a story stay small. Cole followed her gaze toward the wagons, disappearing down the frozen road. He understood immediately, his jaw tightened once, though his voice stayed calm. "I should left before sunrise." Rosalie pulled the blanket tighter around herself. It wouldn't have mattered. The cold morning air settled heavily between them. Cole stepped closer like he meant to say something more. Instead, he stopped himself, that restraint again, always stopping just short of taking too much space in her life. "I'll come by later," he said quietly. Rosalie shook her head immediately. "No." Cole looked at her carefully. The town's already talking, she continued. Don't give them more. For the first time since she'd known him, something sharp flickered behind his eyes. I don't much care what Cedar Ridge thinks, but I do. That silenced him. Not because he disagreed, because he finally understood the weight she had carried alone all these years. Cole nodded once and climbed into the saddle without another argument. Rosalie watched him ride away beneath the pale winter sky. This time, the silence he left behind felt colder than before. By afternoon, the whispers had already spread through town. Rosalie felt them the second she stepped into Dawson's general store for lamp oil and flour. Conversations lowered when she passed. Two women near the canned peaches stopped speaking altogether. At the back counter, Vivian Caldwell stood beside her father, wearing a dark green coat trimmed with fur at the collar. She looked Rosalie over slowly, from boots to face. Well, Vivian said lightly, the storm seems to have brought unexpected company to your doorstep. Rosalie set coins onto the counter carefully. Morning to you too, mister. Caldwell pretended not to hear. Vivian smiled without warmth. Cole Mercer always did have a weakness for strays. The words landed quietly. That made them worse. Rosalie picked up her flour sack without responding. But before she reached the door, another voice cut across the room. That's enough, Vivian. Everyone turned. Eli Turner stood near the stove, pulling off his gloves. Snow dusted his shoulders from the ride into town. Vivian raised an eyebrow. I didn't ask for your opinion. No, Eli replied calmly. But you got it anyway. Rosalie felt every eye in the store shift toward her again. Heat rose into her face. She hated this. Hated becoming something people discussed while pretending not to stare. Outside, wind swept hard along Main Street. Eli caught up beside her near the hitching post. You all right? I'm fine. He nodded slowly, though neither of them believed it. Eli had worked at Cole's ranch nearly 4 years now. Younger than Cole by almost a decade, quieter too. He carried the same kind of stillness men developed after too many winters outdoors. You shouldn't come into town alone for a few days, he said carefully. Rosalie looked up sharply. Because people are gossiping? Because people get mean when they're bored. She adjusted the flour sack against her hip. I've survived worse than gossip. Eli studied her face a moment longer, before taking the sack gently from her hands and loading it into the wagon without asking permission. That small kindness nearly unraveled her more than cruelty would have. At the ranch outside Wind River, things had already begun shifting. 2 ranch hands quit before sunset. One claimed his brother was sick down in Casper. The other barely bothered inventing an excuse. Cole watched them ride off from the porch without trying to stop them. Inside the barn, Eli threw another bale of hay down harder than necessary. This is about the town talking, he muttered. Cole kept repairing a saddle strap beneath the lantern light. Probably. They got no business. They got plenty of business. Cole cut the thread with his knife. Small towns survive on other people's lives. Eli leaned against the stall door, frustrated. You really don't care what they're saying? Cole looked up then. His expression stayed calm, tired more than angry. I care that Rosalie hears it. That answer followed Eli all evening. 3 days later, the bank refused to extend Cole's winter loan. Mr. Caldwell delivered the news personally from behind his polished oak desk while snow drifted past the windows outside. Tough season, the banker said smoothly. Cattle prices are uncertain. Cole stared at the unsigned paperwork lying between them. This loan's been renewed every winter for 6 years. Mr. Caldwell folded his hands. Circumstances change. Cole understood the real meaning immediately. Outside the bank, church bells rang noon across Cedar Ridge. He stood on the wooden sidewalk for a long moment, watching townspeople move through the snow. Some nodded politely. Others looked away too quickly. By the time he reached Rosalie's cabin that evening, darkness had already fallen. Light glowed softly through the curtains. For once, Rosalie did not open the door right away after he knocked. When she finally did, her eyes looked tired. Cole removed his hat slowly. Can I come in? She stepped aside without speaking. Inside, the cabin smelled faintly of rosemary broth simmering near the stove. Rosalie kept her hands folded tightly together while Cole stood near the table. "The bank pulled the loan," he said plainly. Rosalie closed her eyes briefly. "I'm sorry." Cole frowned slightly. "For what?" "This." She gestured vaguely toward the walls, the town, everything between them. "They're doing this because of me." "No. They're doing it because folks like feeling important. But it's hurting you." Cole stepped closer, then stopped himself halfway. "I knew what Cedar Ridge was before I knocked on your door that first night." Rosalie shook her head. "You didn't know what it would become." Silence, stretched. The fire snapped softly in the stove. Finally, Rosalie spoke again, quieter this time. "You should let this go, before it ruins your life too." The words struck harder than she intended. She saw it immediately in the way Cole's shoulders stiffened. "Two," he repeated. Rosalie looked down. Cole let out a slow breath through his nose and reached for his hat again. "I never asked you to carry this alone. You shouldn't have to carry it at all." For the first time since she met him, frustration entered his voice. "You think walking away fixes something?" "I think it saves you." Cole stared at her a long moment after that. Then the anger faded, leaving only exhaustion. "You don't get to decide what's worth staying for," he said quietly. He left before she could answer. The next morning, Rosalie packed a small bag before sunrise. 2 dresses. Her doctor's notes tied together with string. A framed photograph she kept hidden inside the bottom drawer. Outside, snow fell softly across the road, leading north toward Edith Turner's old mountain cabin. Rosalie paused one last time inside her kitchen. The coffee cup Cole used still rested beside the stove, where she hadn't moved it. That hurt most of all. By the time Cedar Ridge woke beneath the gray winter morning, Rosalie Bennett was already gone. The mountain road to Edith Turner's old cabin disappeared beneath fresh snow before noon. Rosalie kept the wagon slow through the narrow pine pass, gloved hands stiff around the reins while cold wind swept down from the hills above Wind River. The farther she traveled from Cedar Ridge, the quieter the world became. No church bells, no gossip drifting through store windows, only snow sliding softly from tree branches and the creak of wagon wheels over frozen ground. Edith's cabin sat alone near the edge of a ridge, overlooking a half-frozen creek. Smoke no longer rose from its chimney. Edith had stopped using the place years earlier, after her husband died during a blizzard farther north. Rosalie unlocked the door with the old brass key Edith once pressed into her hand just in case. Inside smelled faintly of cedar dust and old quilts. She lit the lamps slowly, one by one. That first night felt endless. Wind rattled the shutters, while Rosalie sat beside the stove, wrapped in a blanket with untouched coffee cooling in her hands. Every small sound made her think of Cedar Ridge, of Cole's boots crossing wooden floors, of the low scrape of his chair near the fire. She hated herself for missing him this quickly. At the ranch below Wind River, silence settled differently. Cole noticed it most at supper. The second plate stayed untouched across the table. The coffee pot burned too long on the stove because nobody reminded him to pull it sooner. Even the horses seemed restless beneath the barn lanterns. 3 nights after Rosalie left, Eli found Cole still awake near midnight repairing fence wire by hand inside the barn. "You should sleep," Eli muttered. Cole twisted the pliers once more without looking up. "Fence won't fix itself. That fence ain't broken." That finally made Cole stop. Cold air drifted through the barn doors, carrying snowflakes across the floorboards. Eli leaned against the stall quietly. "She gone for good?" Cole stared toward the dark hills north of town. "I don't know." It was the first uncertain thing Eli had ever heard from him. Days passed heavily after that. Rosalie tried keeping herself busy at the mountain cabin. She swept floors already clean, repaired curtains that barely needed stitching, chopped wood until her shoulders burned. But loneliness followed her anyway. Not the old loneliness she knew how to survive. This one felt sharper because now she understood what absence looked like after being cared for. One morning she woke dizzy enough to grip the edge of the washbasin. The room tilted briefly before settling again. Rosalie blamed the altitude first, then the cold, then exhaustion. Still, the weakness returned the next day, and the next. By the end of the week, even the smell of coffee turned her stomach. Snow fell nearly non-stop across the mountains by Christmas week. At dawn one morning, Rosalie stepped outside, carrying water from the pump, when sudden dizziness struck again. The bucket slipped from her hands, crashing against the frozen ground, as darkness rushed briefly across her vision. She barely caught herself against the porch rail. A voice called her name sharply. Rosalie looked up. Cole Mercer sat horseback near the tree line below the cabin. Snow covered his shoulders and hat brim. He must have ridden through the storm half the night. For a long second, neither moved. Then Cole climbed down from the saddle immediately and crossed the yard toward her. What happened? Nothing. Her answer came too fast. Cole's eyes moved from the spilled water bucket to the way her hand gripped the porch rail too tightly. You're pale. I'm fine. You keep saying that. The quiet frustration in his voice nearly broke her all over again. Cole picked up the fallen bucket and set it carefully beside the door before looking at her fully. You left without even letting me say goodbye. Rosalie folded her arms tightly against herself. That would have made it harder. For who? She couldn't answer. Snow drifted softly around them. Cole stepped closer slowly this time, giving her every chance to walk away. I don't care what Cedar Ridge thinks, he said quietly. I don't care what the bank says. I don't care what people whisper when I walk into town. Rosalie looked down at the snow packed around her boots. You should, she whispered. Cole shook his head once. Rosie. His voice lowered gently. Look at me. She did. And that was the mistake. Because the second she met his eyes, all the exhaustion she'd been holding together began slipping loose. I'm tired, she admitted softly. I'm tired of feeling like everywhere I go becomes harder for the people around me. Cole's expression changed immediately. Not pity. Never that. Something steadier. He reached out slowly and brushed melting snow from the sleeve of her coat. The gesture felt so careful Rosalie nearly cried right there on the porch. You don't ruin things, he said. You just spent too long around people who made you believe you did. Silence settled between them again. Then suddenly Rosalie swayed slightly. Cole caught her elbow at once. Rosie, I'm all right, but even she heard how weak her voice sounded now. Cole didn't argue further. An hour later, he had her wrapped in blankets inside the wagon, heading back towards Cedar Ridge through the falling snow, despite her quiet protests. By dusk, Doc Harris stood beside the examination room window in his small clinic above Dawson's pharmacy, papers spread across the desk beneath a lantern. Rosalie sat stiffly on the edge of the bed while Cole remained near the wall beside the coat rack, arms folded tightly across his chest. The doctor removed his spectacles slowly. Well, he said carefully, this is unexpected. Rosalie's stomach tightened. Doc Harris glanced between them once before continuing. You're pregnant, Miss Bennett. The room went perfectly still. Outside, wind rattled lightly against the clinic windows. Rosalie stared at the doctor without breathing. That's not possible, she whispered. The older man cleared his throat gently. Given your history, I understand why you'd think that. But the results are clear enough. Cole had not moved at all. Rosalie slowly lowered one hand against her abdomen as though touching someone else's life by mistake. There are risks, Doc Harris continued carefully. Your fever, years ago, caused damage. We'll need to monitor things closely through winter. But Rosalie barely heard the rest, because across the room, Cole Mercer was looking at her with an expression she had never seen before. Not triumph, not shock, fear, deep and quiet and real. And when their eyes finally met, he crossed the room without hesitation and took her hand into both of his like it was the only thing keeping him standing upright. Maybe that's the part that stays with you long after the story ends. Not the storm, not the whispers in town, not even the miracle neither of them thought could happen. Maybe it's the feeling of finally being chosen without having to prove your worth first. If you've ever sat alone at a kitchen table wondering whether life had already passed you by, If you've ever believed one painful sentence could define the rest of your future, then you probably understand Rosalie more than she ever would have admitted out loud. Some people spend years guarding the broken places inside themselves so carefully that they forget what it feels like to let another person near them. And sometimes love doesn't arrive loudly. Sometimes it shows up quietly in a snowstorm carrying firewood, waiting outside the door. Staying when leaving would have been easier. That's what made Cole different. He never tried to save Rosalie from her life. He simply stood beside her long enough that she no longer had to carry it alone. And maybe that's what healing really looks like. Not perfection, not certainty, just someone staying. If this story meant something to you, tell me where you were listening from tonight. And if you'd like, stay a little longer with us here on the porch. There are still more Western stories waiting down these cold roads ahead. Stories about second chances, quiet hearts, and the kind of love that keeps the light on for someone coming home late.